She married a billionaire who was on death's doorstep, but she didn't know how it would turn out. Subscribe to not miss new videos. Write in the comments where you watch this video from. Emma Hollis had never thought her life would take such a turn. At 26, she had long given up on fairy tales. The world wasn't kind to people like her, people born in the wrong part of the city with no family wealth or safety net. She had grown up learning how to stretch a dollar, how to survive on tips, and how to smile even when exhaustion pulled at the edges of her lips. Her daily life was a loop she couldn't escape. She worked as a bartender in a dimly lit Miami club, the kind where wealthy men came to drink away the night and young women with tired eyes served them with fake smiles. The pay was miserable, the hours brutal, but it kept her in her tiny studio apartment on the outskirts of downtown. The apartment wasn't much: peel-in wallpaper, an ancient air conditioner that coughed more than it cooled, and pipes that rattled whenever she turned on the water. Her neighbors were loud, their arguments spilling through the paper-thin walls at all hours. She barely slept, barely had time to think about what came next. She had once believed she could do something else, something better. She had even tried college, one semester of night classes before the bills piled up and the dream dissolved. Now, she was just another face behind the bar, pouring drinks for men who barely looked at her unless they were leering. And then, one night, everything changed. She noticed him immediately. He wasn't like the other men who came in. No drunken laughter, no slurred orders. He sat in the VIP section surrounded by security, watching the room with sharp, assessing eyes. He was old, easily in his late 80s or early 90s, but there was something about him that made him impossible to ignore. Olivier Randolph. The name echoed in her mind like a legend. He was one of the richest men in the country, a self-made billionaire who had built his empire from nothing. He had owned companies before she was even born. He was the kind of man who had shaped industries, destroyed competitors, and survived longer than anyone had expected. And now he was here, watching her. She tried not to stare, but it was impossible to ignore the way his eyes followed her movements as she mixed drinks, the way he whispered something to his assistant, who then approached the bar. The man, dressed in an immaculate black suit, slid a card onto the counter. "Mr. Randolph would like to speak with you." Emma hesitated, glancing toward the VIP section. A man like Randolph didn't summon people for no reason. The logical thing to do was to decline, to stay in her lane. But logic had never paid her bills. She wiped her hands on her apron and nodded, stepping out from behind the bar. The walk across the club felt longer than it should have. When she reached the table, Randolph gestured for her to sit. His voice, though weak with age, still carried weight. "You're wasting yourself here," he said simply. Emma blinked, caught off guard. Randolph studied her face for a moment before continuing. "What do you want, Miss Hollis?" It was a question no one had asked her in a long time. She hesitated. To not be stuck. His thin lips curved slightly. Good answer. That night, he made her an offer. At first, she thought she had misheard him. He wanted her to accompany him to events, to act as his companion at business functions, to be seen with him in public. He would compensate her handsomely. It sounded too good to be true, which meant it probably was. But Emma wasn't in a position to turn down opportunities. She agreed. The next few weeks passed in a blur. Dinners at five-star restaurants, galas where the champagne never stopped flowing, silent rides in black limousines. She became a part of his carefully curated image, a beautiful young woman on the arm of an aging mogul. The money was real. The security was intoxicating. For the first time in years, she wasn't counting tips at the end of the night, wondering if she could afford groceries and rent. Then, one evening, he made a second offer. Marriage? She nearly laughed at first, thinking it was a joke. But Randolph wasn't the kind of man who joked. He laid it out plainly. He needed a wife, not for love, not for companionship, but for optics. A young, beautiful bride would solidify his legacy, maintain his public image, and silence whispers about his decline in health. And in return, Emma would be set for life. She would have access to wealth beyond anything she had ever imagined. Private estates, luxury cars, bank accounts, with more zeros than she could count. There would be conditions, of course. She would have to play the role convincingly, attend events, smile for the cameras, and she would never, under any circumstances, expect to inherit his fortune. The last part made her pause. If there was no inheritance, then what was in it for her? Randolph seemed to read her thoughts. He promised financial security. Not billions, not control over his empire, but enough to ensure she would never have to work another shift behind a bar again. She had a choice. She could walk away now, go back to her tiny apartment and the suffocating loop of her life. Or she could take the deal. She thought about it long after she left his mansion that night. She lay in bed, staring at the cracked ceiling, listening to the muffled arguments of her neighbors, feeling the weight of the choice pressing down on her. It wasn't just about money. It was about survival, about escaping the life she had always known. By morning, her decision was made. She called Randolph's assistant and gave her answer. She would marry him. The wedding was a spectacle. Emma had never seen anything like it. The venue was one of the most expensive hotels in New York, a grand ballroom adorned with chandeliers dripping with crystals, floral arrangements taller than people, and a guest list that read like the who's who of the business and entertainment elite. Cameras flashed as she walked down the aisle, every step carefully measured, every detail meticulously planned. She wore a gown that felt more like an artifact than a dress, hand-sewn beads, a train that trailed behind her like something out of a fairy tale. Her makeup was flawless, her hair styled in waves that framed her face in effortless perfection. And at the end of the aisle sat Olivier Randolph, his sharp eyes watching her beneath heavy lids. He was in his wheelchair, of course. The years had taken their toll on his body, but not on his mind. His suit was immaculate, tailored to fit his thin frame, his hands resting motionless on the armrests. The ceremony was quick, efficient. Words were spoken, vows exchanged. A kiss, brief, barely there. And then it was done. She was now Mrs. Olivier Randolph. The reception was as extravagant as the ceremony, a grand display of wealth and status. Celebrities, politicians, industry moguls, they all came to shake Olivier's hand, to pay their respects, to take a curious glance at his new wife. Some smiled at her, others whispered behind champagne glasses. She knew what they were saying. Gold digger, trophy wife, she won't last a year. She smiled anyway. The night dragged on, a blur of speeches, toasts, and music. She played her role perfectly, holding Olivier's hand when needed, laughing at the right moments, allowing photographers to capture the perfect angles. She barely ate. By the time they left, her cheeks ached from smiling. The honeymoon was a farce. They flew to Europe in a private jet, touching down in Paris, then the Amalfi Coast. It was for the cameras, the image of newlywed bliss. Photographers snapped shots of her walking along the beach, sitting at candlelit dinners, always next to Olivier. But behind closed doors, the truth was stark. There was no intimacy, no warmth. Their rooms were separate, their interactions brief. Olivier had made it clear from the start. This was a transaction, not a marriage. He had gotten what he wanted, and now she had to hold up her end of the deal. Emma had thought it would be easy. She hadn't expected the loneliness. The Randolph estate was a fortress, a sprawling mansion outside of New York, surrounded by acres of manicured gardens, marble floors that echoed underfoot, and halls so vast they swallowed sound. She had never lived anywhere so grand, yet she had never felt more trapped. The staff were polite, but distant. She was their employer, but not one of them. Olivier had a strict routine. He woke early, had meetings with his advisors, read the paper in silence. She saw him for scheduled appearances, fundraisers, board meetings, charity galas. They traveled together, but they weren't together. It didn't take long for the boredom to set in. She had no job, no responsibilities. She was expected to look beautiful, be presentable, smile when necessary. It was suffocating. She started shopping, designer boutiques, high-end jewelry stores. At first, it felt like power, like control. She could have anything she wanted. But material things only filled the void for so long. Then came the parties. Emma was now part of a world that thrived on excess. Lavish gatherings in penthouses, yacht parties where champagne never stopped flowing, exclusive clubs where the elite drowned themselves in luxury. She learned to navigate this world quickly. She made connections, built a persona. She was no longer just a bartender from Miami. She was Mrs. Randolph, a woman who belonged, but not everyone accepted her. Olivier's sons, Edward and Jason, made their feelings clear from the start. They despised her. They barely acknowledged her presence, only speaking to her when necessary. They had grown up expecting to inherit everything, and now a stranger had entered their father's life, disrupting the balance. Edward, the older one, was the more dangerous of the two. He was calculated, controlled, always watching. Jason, on the other hand, was reckless, volatile, prone to outbursts. Neither trusted her. She overheard their conversations. "She's after his money. She won't last. Just wait." She pretended not to care, but she knew the truth. They were waiting for her to fail. Olivier, of course, didn't care. He knew what people thought. He had built his life on not caring. She envied that about him. As the months passed, she became better at playing the role. She attended meetings with him, learned business terms, smiled at investors. People underestimated her. They thought she was nothing more than a pretty face, a pawn in an old man's game. She let them believe it. But deep down, she knew she had to be more than that, because one day this arrangement would end. And when it did, she needed to be ready. Olivier died on a quiet October morning. There was no dramatic collapse, no frantic calls to paramedics. He simply stopped breathing in his sleep, his frail body giving in after years of fighting against time. The news spread quickly, and within hours the estate was swarming with people, lawyers, advisors, family members who had barely visited when he was alive, but now arrived in droves, speaking in hushed tones, their eyes already fixed on what was left behind. Emma stood in the master bedroom, staring at the empty bed where he had taken his last breath. She had expected to feel something, grief, sadness, even relief, but there was only numbness. Their marriage had never been real. He had been a presence in her life, a force to orbit around, but he had never been hers. And now he was gone. The funeral was an elaborate affair, held at an exclusive cathedral where the city's elite came to pay their respects. Cameras flashed as she stepped out of the limousine, a black veil covering her face, every movement carefully controlled. She played the grieving widow, walking behind the casket, accepting condolences with a somber nod. She knew the whispers had already begun. People were watching, waiting for her to slip, to show any sign that her sadness wasn't genuine. Edward and Jason were there, standing at the front of the church, their expressions carefully composed. They had never accepted her, and now they no longer had to pretend to tolerate her presence. They knew what was coming. They had been waiting for this moment since the day she walked into their father's life. 3 days after the funeral, the will was read. Emma sat in the grand study of the Randolph estate, surrounded by lawyers in dark suits, the air thick with tension. The family was there. Edward, Jason, their wives, their children. Other distant relatives had gathered as well, some hopeful, others just there to witness the spectacle. The lawyer, a gray-haired man who had served Olivier for decades, began reading the document in a slow, deliberate tone. The empire, the billions, the companies, all of it went to Edward. Jason received a substantial trust along with a few smaller assets. There were donations to charities, grants for institutions Olivier had supported throughout his life. And then, at the very end, came her name. The estate in upstate New York. A small financial sum, enough to ensure she wouldn't be left destitute, but nothing compared to the fortune she had lived beside for the past 2 years. It was done. That was it. She had expected this outcome, had prepared for it. Olivier had told her from the beginning that she wouldn't inherit his empire. She had convinced herself she was fine with it, but sitting there, listening to it spoken aloud, watching the barely concealed smirks on Edward's and Jason's faces, something inside her cracked. Edward leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, looking at her with barely veiled amusement. Jason exhaled sharply, shaking his head as if he had always known she was a fool for thinking she could be anything more than a footnote in their father's legacy. The room emptied quickly after that. People muttered half-hearted condolences, avoiding her gaze as they left. She remained seated, staring at the document in front of her. It was over. Except it wasn't. The first lawsuit came 2 weeks later. She hadn't even been the one to file it. Her lawyer had, after reviewing the will and determining there were irregularities in the estate distribution. It was a long shot, but a valid one. There were inconsistencies in the way certain assets had been transferred. Papers that should have been signed weren't. Transactions that should have been accounted for were missing from the official records. She knew what people would say. She was a young widow fighting for money that wasn't hers. The media would feast on it, twisting the narrative to fit whatever version of events entertained them the most. Edward responded with immediate aggression, his lawyers filing counterclaims, dragging her through every legal loophole they could find. The tabloids erupted, branding her a gold digger, a desperate woman clinging to wealth that was never meant to be hers. She didn't care. She wasn't after the empire. She was after what she was owed. She hadn't been naive. She knew what the marriage was. But she had played her role, and she had played it well. She had upheld her end of the deal, and now she refused to walk away empty-handed while the people who had despised her from the beginning gloated over their victory. The case dragged on for months. She hired a team of the best attorneys money could buy, but Edward had resources beyond anything she could match. He made it personal, using his influence to ensure that no court would make things easy for her. He didn't want to just win. He wanted to destroy her. Then came the threats. Anonymous messages, veiled warnings that appeared in the press. Rumors spread, stories about her past, about her life before Olivier. Reporters dug through her history, twisting truths into scandal. The pressure was relentless. That was when she met Daniel Harper. He wasn't like the other lawyers she had worked with. He didn't care about the headlines, didn't try to manage her public image. He only cared about winning. He was sharp, meticulous, and utterly ruthless. He told her from the start that if she wanted to win, she had to be willing to fight dirty. There was no room for hesitation, no room for mercy. She listened. The legal war escalated. She followed Daniel's advice, countering Edward's every move with one of her own. She stopped playing defense and went on the attack, filing additional claims, challenging every aspect of the estate's distribution. She exposed the gaps in Edward's control, forcing him to defend himself at every turn. The tabloids began shifting their narrative. She was no longer just a gold digger. She was a woman scorned, a widow fighting for what was rightfully hers. Public opinion wavered. For the first time, Edward seemed uncertain. And then, after a year of battle, something shifted. She received a call late one evening, a private conversation, a deal. Edward was willing to settle. The details were negotiated behind closed doors. Money would be transferred, certain assets reallocated. It wasn't everything she had hoped for, but it was more than she had started with. She accepted. The court case was officially closed 2 weeks later. The settlement was sealed, confidential. The press never knew the full amount. All they saw was a carefully staged press conference where she thanked the Randolph family for their cooperation and expressed her desire to move on with her life. It was over. But she wasn't free. The fight had changed her. The endless months of battles, of watching people try to break her, of knowing she had to keep pushing or be crushed, it had taken something from her. She could feel the exhaustion in her bones and the way she barely reacted when she saw another headline with her name in it. The lawyers withdrew, the cameras faded, the public moved on. Only Daniel remained. And in the silence that followed, he was the only one who understood what she had lost. The settlement had been reached, but it wasn't a victory. Emma had fought, and she had survived, but she hadn't won, not in the way she had once imagined. The money was substantial, enough to keep her comfortable, enough to ensure she never had to pour another drink behind a bar. But it wasn't the empire she had glimpsed from the inside. The war had left scars, invisible but deep, and she felt them every time she woke up to silence in the vast house she now owned. She had spent over a year in battle, and now that it was over, she didn't know what to do with herself. The press moved on quickly. There were new scandals to chase, new stories to dissect. Emma's name lingered in the tabloids for a while, mentions of a mysterious settlement, speculation about whether she had walked away with millions or nothing at all. But eventually, even the gossip columns lost interest. She had become old news, but not to Edward. She had expected him to let it go after the settlement, to turn his attention back to the empire he had fought so viciously to protect. Instead, he lingered. She heard whispers in business circles, quiet remarks from people who had once stood in his orbit. He was still watching her. He still wanted her gone. The financial settlement had closed the case legally, but it hadn't erased her. She was still here, still carrying the name that he believed should have never belonged to her in the first place. That was the real problem. She had been a temporary embarrassment while their father was alive, but now she was a permanent stain on his legacy. Daniel Harper had warned her this would happen. He had seen it too many times before. Edward wasn't just a man protecting his fortune. He was a man who didn't tolerate loose ends. And Emma, no matter how silent she remained, was a loose end. She had spent months in the courtroom, months playing by the rules, believing that the system would deliver some kind of justice. But justice wasn't real in this world. There were only winners and losers, and the people who stayed alive were the ones who knew how to shift between those roles when necessary. The threats started small. Anonymous phone calls quickly disconnected. Papers slid under her door with no return address, advising her to leave the city. She ignored them at first. It was psychological warfare, and she had survived worse. But then her accounts were frozen. One morning, she woke up to find that the money from her settlement, the money that was supposed to ensure her survival, was locked behind legal technicalities. Calls to the bank led to vague explanations about ongoing verifications and internal reviews. It wasn't a mistake. It was Edward. Daniel confirmed it within hours. "He's not done with you," he told her, his voice steady, calm. Emma felt the anger rise in her chest, not the sharp burning kind, but the cold, quiet rage that settled in the bones. She had played by their rules. She had fought the way they told her to fight. And now, even after all of it, Edward still thought he could break her. She didn't call him. She didn't beg. Instead, she made her own move. Daniel had spent years navigating these kinds of battles, and he knew exactly where to hit back. While Edward had spent his time tying up Emma's money in legal red tape, Daniel had been digging. And what he had found was leverage. Olivier had been a ruthless businessman, but he hadn't been perfect. He had left things behind. Deals that had never been meant to see the light of day. Transactions that, if exposed, would be more than just embarrassing. They would be devastating. Edward had spent years trying to clean up after his father, to bury the past where no one could find it. But Daniel had found enough to make it clear that if Edward didn't back off, the world would see the parts of the Randolph empire that weren't quite as pristine as the family liked to pretend. It took 3 days. On the morning of the 4th day, Emma's accounts were mysteriously unfrozen. No explanation, no phone call, just a quiet retreat. She had won this battle, but she knew it was temporary. Edward would never fully let go, but he had learned something about her, just as she had learned something about him. She wasn't an easy target. The weight of it settled over her in the weeks that followed. The realization that she was never truly safe, that no amount of money or settlements or closed cases could erase what she had been through. She had fought to be more than a footnote, and now she was something worse. An inconvenient truth that the Randolph family couldn't erase. She stopped going to social events. The invitations still came, but she ignored them. The people who had once courted her presence, who had smiled at her during the galas and whispered about her behind her back, no longer mattered. She spent more time with Daniel. At first, it was business, strategizing, ensuring that she was protected, making sure Edward didn't make another move. But at some point, it became something else. He was different from the men she had known. He didn't look at her with pity or with judgment. He didn't see her as a victim or a prize. He saw her as something else entirely, an equal. She hadn't realized how much she needed that until it was already too late. The legal battles had ended, but Emma had not escaped unscathed. Victory had come at a cost, one that settled deep into her bones and refused to let go. She had spent so long fighting, so long clawing her way through courtrooms and public scrutiny, that she no longer knew how to exist without conflict. The silence was unbearable. It followed her from room to room in the house she had won, echoing through the halls like a ghost she couldn't shake. She had spent the past 2 years surrounded by people, lawyers, journalists, enemies dressed as allies, and allies who turned out to be enemies. Now there was nothing. The invitations had stopped coming. The people who had once used her name in whispered conversations had moved on to new scandals. She had become irrelevant. And yet the damage lingered. The exhaustion was different now. Before, it had been the kind that pushed her forward, the kind that drove her to fight, to survive. Now it weighed her down, pressing against her with every step. She had money, security, a name that still carried weight in the right circles. But none of it mattered. She had spent so long chasing the promise of a life beyond struggle, and now that she had it, she didn't know what to do with it. She started drinking more. At first, it was just a glass of wine at night, something to dull the edge of her thoughts. But soon, one glass turned into 2, then 3, then something stronger. She told herself it was temporary, just a way to quiet her mind, to help her sleep. But the nights blurred together, and she found herself waking up in the early hours of the morning, disoriented, her throat dry, her head pounding. She wasn't sleeping. Not really. Even when she did, the nightmares came. She dreamed of courtrooms, of endless voices arguing over her fate. She dreamed of Olivier, his sharp eyes watching her even in death, his expression unreadable. She dreamed of Edward, his smirk as the will was read, the way he had looked at her like she was nothing more than an insect beneath his shoe. And then there were the other dreams, the ones she couldn't explain, the ones where she was falling, drowning, suffocating under something invisible yet crushing. She started seeing Daniel more often, though she wasn't sure if it was by choice or because he refused to let her disappear. He didn't ask about the drinking, though she knew he noticed. He didn't comment on the way her hands shook when she reached for a glass, or the way she sometimes stared at nothing for minutes at a time, lost in thoughts she couldn't articulate. Instead, he talked about the future, about moving forward, about rebuilding. She listened, but she didn't believe in it. She had already burned through too much of herself. She had fought too many battles, lost too many pieces along the way. There was nothing left to rebuild. The first time she ran out of pills, she convinced herself it wasn't a big deal. She had started taking them months ago, first for sleep, then for anxiety, then because the idea of getting through a day without them was unbearable. It wasn't an addiction. She could stop any time she wanted. She just didn't want to. But when she tried to go a night without them, her body rebelled. The shaking got worse. Her skin felt too tight, her heart beat too loud. She lay awake until the sun rose, staring at the ceiling, feeling like something inside her was trying to crawl its way out. She called the doctor that morning, making up an excuse about misplacing her prescription. He refilled it without question. For a while, that was enough, but then the pills stopped working the way they used to. She had to take more to feel the same calm, the same silence. It was fine. She could handle it. Daniel didn't bring it up until one night when he found her sitting on the floor of her bedroom, surrounded by empty bottles. She hadn't expected him to be there. She didn't even remember letting him in. He didn't say anything at first, just looked at her, his expression unreadable. Then, finally, he asked, "How long are you going to do this?" She wanted to snap at him, to tell him to leave, to remind him that he wasn't her keeper, but she couldn't find the words. She was too tired. He stayed that night, sitting in a chair near the window, not speaking, just watching. In the morning, she threw out the bottles, but she kept the pills. She told herself she was still in control. She wasn't. The court case was over, the money was hers, the world had moved on. Emma thought victory would feel different. She thought it would bring a sense of peace, of accomplishment, of closure. Instead, it felt like nothing. She had spent years fighting for this moment, clawing her way through every legal battle, enduring the media's relentless scrutiny, and standing in the wreckage of a marriage that had never been real. Now that it was done, she felt like she had been emptied out and left with nothing but silence. The house was quiet in a way that made her stomach twist. The grand estate in upstate New York, once a symbol of security, now felt like a tomb. She moved through its hallways without purpose, aimless, drifting between rooms she barely recognized as her own. She had nowhere to be, nothing to do. She had won, and yet she had lost everything that had once made her feel alive. She stopped checking the news, stopped caring what people were saying about her. She knew the world had already started to forget her, the way it always did when scandals lost their novelty. The same papers that had once torn her apart had moved on to newer, fresher names. She had become yesterday's drama, a woman whose story had been picked apart and discarded. The money sat untouched in her accounts, more than she had ever imagined having, but it didn't change the way she felt when she woke up in the morning. She still felt like she was sinking. Daniel called often. He checked in, offered suggestions about what she could do next. She had influence now, he told her. She could start something of her own, use the attention she still had to reshape her image, to build a new life. He talked about foundations, investments, charity work. He saw a future for her that she couldn't see for herself. She knew he meant well, but she didn't want to build anything. She wanted to disappear. The drinking got worse. The pills, too. She kept it hidden at first, but Daniel wasn't stupid. He saw the signs, the empty bottles, the unreturned calls, the way she avoided looking at him when they met in person. She knew what he wanted to say. She could hear it in the way he hesitated before speaking, the way his gaze lingered on her too long, the way his jaw tightened whenever she reached for another drink. She dared him to say it. He never did. Maybe that was why she kept him around. She married him on a cold, gray afternoon. There was no grand wedding this time, no headlines, no photographers waiting to capture the moment. Just a courthouse, a brief exchange of vows, and a signature on a piece of paper that changed her name once again. She wasn't sure why she did it. Maybe because it made sense. Because Daniel had been there when no one else was. Because he understood what she had been through, what she had lost. Because she was tired of being alone. But it wasn't love. She didn't think Daniel expected it to be. It was a partnership, a transaction. He stabilized her, kept her from falling apart completely. But even he couldn't fix what was already broken. Emma had thought marriage would change something. Maybe it would ground her, give her a sense of stability, a reason to pull herself out of the numb haze that had settled over her life. But after the courthouse ceremony, after the papers were signed and Daniel became her husband, nothing felt different. The house was still too large, the silence still suffocating. She spent most of her days drifting. She would wake up without a purpose, move from room to room, pour herself a drink before noon. The pills were always within reach. Sometimes she took one to take the edge off, sometimes two. She told herself she could stop if she wanted to. She just didn't want to. Daniel never pressed her. He had always been patient, always careful with his words. He would watch her with the same unreadable expression, waiting for her to say something she never did. He knew what was happening, knew that she was slipping further and further away, but he never confronted her. Maybe he thought she would come back to herself eventually. Maybe he was waiting for her to decide if she even wanted to. The nights were the worst. She would lie awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing with thoughts she couldn't silence. Memories came in flashes. Her first night in Olivier's house, the look on Edward's face when the will was read, the way the cameras had flashed at her wedding, the whispered voices that had followed her everywhere she went. She had spent so long fighting, but for what? One evening, she found herself sitting by the large bay window in the master bedroom, a half-empty bottle of whiskey on the table beside her. The city lights stretched out in the distance, glittering and cold. She wondered what people saw when they looked up at this house. Did they think she was still the same woman who had fought for a place in Olivier's world? Did they imagine she was still powerful, still untouchable? She picked up her phone and scrolled through the news, barely paying attention to the words. Edward's name still came up from time to time. He had moved on, just as she had known he would. He had won in the end, had taken what he wanted and left her to fade into obscurity. That should have made her angry, but she felt nothing. She was nothing. The thought settled in her chest, heavy and final. She had spent so long trying to prove she was more than a trophy wife, more than a woman who had married for convenience. But in the end, she had become exactly what they had expected. A woman who had taken the money and disappeared. A woman who had nothing left to fight for. She closed her eyes and leaned her head against the glass. She didn't know how long she sat there before she heard footsteps behind her. She didn't turn around. She knew it was Daniel. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, finally, he spoke. "You should get some rest." His voice was quiet, careful. He had been speaking to her like this more often lately, as if she was something fragile, something that could shatter if he wasn't careful. Maybe she was. She let out a breath and nodded, though she knew she wouldn't sleep. Daniel lingered for a moment before turning and walking away. She listened to the sound of his footsteps fading down the hall. She wondered if he knew. If he knew that she wasn't coming back from this. Emma Hollis died quietly. There were no flashing lights, no frantic calls to 911. When they found her, she was lying on the plush white bed in the master suite of a luxury hotel. The room was immaculate, the sheets crisp and unwrinkled, as if she had merely lain down for a moment and drifted off to sleep. The coroner's report was clinical, detached. Acute drug toxicity, a blend of prescription medications and alcohol, a lethal combination that numbed her into a permanent escape. Officially, it was ruled an accidental overdose. Unofficially, no one was surprised. The news of her death spread quickly, but the story was small. A brief segment on the morning talk shows, a few lines in the gossip columns. There were whispers about her past, about her marriage to Olivier Randolph, the court battles, the settlement. Old pictures resurfaced, the young, vibrant Emma on the arm of a billionaire, her smile wide, her eyes bright. The media recycled the same narratives, the gold digger, the tragic widow, the woman who had clawed her way into a fortune and lost herself along the way, but the world moved on. Within a week, her name had faded from the headlines. There were new scandals, new tragedies, new lives to dissect. Emma Hollis became a footnote, a cautionary tale whispered in high society circles. The woman who had everything and still found nothing but emptiness. Her funeral was small, There were no cameras, no crowds, a modest service in a quiet cemetery. Daniel Harper stood at the graveside, his face a mask of solemnity. He was the only one who spoke. His words were brief, a simple farewell. There was no mention of the battles she had fought, no recounting of the hardships she had endured, just a quiet acknowledgment that she had existed, that her story had reached its end. After the funeral, the paperwork began. Emma had died without a will, and as her legal spouse, Daniel inherited everything. The house, the remaining settlement money, the few assets she had managed to hold on to through the legal storms. He handled it all with quiet efficiency, meeting with lawyers and accountants, signing documents with a steady hand. He sold the house first. It went quickly, bought by a tech millionaire looking for a retreat from the city. The rest of her possessions were liquidated just as swiftly, turned into numbers on a screen, assets that could be moved and managed with the push of a button. Daniel didn't linger in the house. As soon as the last of the paperwork was finalized, he moved on. He had always been practical, always looking forward. There were other clients, other opportunities. He knew how to navigate this world, how to emerge from the shadows of someone else's tragedy with clean hands and a clear path forward. He gave a single interview to a financial magazine, not about Emma, but about his work. He spoke about the complexities of estate management, about the challenges of navigating high-stakes inheritances. He was calm, articulate, a man who had simply done his job. When asked about his late wife, he expressed his sorrow, his condolences, his hope that her memory would be honored. His voice never wavered. The world accepted his story. It was easier that way. In time, even those who had known Emma stopped speaking of her. Her story became just another whisper, a fragment of gossip shared at dinner parties, a name that elicited brief, knowing nods before the conversation shifted to something else. And Daniel remained, unbothered, unburdened. He had learned long ago how to survive in this world. He knew when to fight, when to retreat, and when to let things die on their own. In the end, the story wasn't about Emma. It was about the people who remained after she was gone. The ones who understood that in a world built on power and perception, the real winners were those who knew how to walk away with everything while leaving nothing behind. Emma had thought she could win, that she could carve out a place for herself, that she could change the rules of the game. She had believed in victory, in justice, in some kind of redemption, but in this world, only those who understood the game truly survived. And Daniel Harper had always known how to win. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss what's next. Check out more of our videos for more fascinating stories, and don't forget to share this one with others.